Welcome to the January 2022 edition of Tea and Tarot. And I'm very excited to do this class with you tonight. And we're going to talk about dedicated decks, having a dedicated deck, dedicating a deck, how you might go about selecting one, what are some of the pros and cons of having a dedicated deck, as well as thoughts about how to look at decks with an eye toward dedicating them to beings that we might want to connect with or work with. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about why I work with a dedicated deck, and I'm open to hearing about your experiences as well if anyone cares to share. And then we're going to go through and look at some of the dedicated decks that I have. And the reason that this topic even came up is because I noticed that Priestess Mia asked the other day about a dedicated deck for working with Aphrodite. And so did Priestess Lisette. Sybil Lisette the other day asked about working with a dedicated deck for Hakkate. And I thought, oh, how interesting that this topic seems to be coming up, and it seemed like it was a fruitful time to maybe have a broader discussion about it that would benefit all of us. So what is a dedicated deck? Well, that in and of itself is an interesting question. On the one hand, a dedicated deck might be your regular everyday working deck that you then dedicate to a particular guardian, goddess, guide, or spirit that helps you with your readings. 2, you can have dedicated decks that are for the messages from specific beings. Or 3, you can have decks that are dedicated for particular purposes, such as a deck that you use for a particular type of reading versus a different type of reading. So we're going to cover all 3 of those. The first part that we're going to talk about, which I think is probably the simplest and probably some of you might have some experience with already, is working with a dedicated deck that is your regular working deck and how you've chosen to dedicate it. I have a process that I do with a new deck that I'm going to work with for a period of time. And as I think I've mentioned in this class before, many years ago, I set out to become a master of the tarot, and I didn't actually know what it meant to do that. I had no idea. There's no like accreditation program, or at least there wasn't at that point. By now there might be, who knows? But I decided that for me, what equaled mastery of the tarot would be to do to work with 10 different decks over the course of 10 years and to do 1,000 readings per deck. So over the period of 10 years, I dedicated 10 different decks and I did 1,000 readings at least a year for those 10 years. And that's what I decided equated mastery. That was my self-described master's degree in tarot. Everybody's approaches may be different, but over the years, I've read about a bunch of different ways to dedicate your personal deck. And the one that has worked the best for me, that has made the most sense for me personally, has not been to dedicate a deck to a particular being or spirit for use with my everyday readings. And that's in part because I had some question marks around if I dedicated my regular working deck to a particular being, would that then obligate any querent that I was reading for who received information from that deck to do some type of devotional activity for that being if, you know, there would be some kind of linkage created there. And I'm not in the business of sort of conscripting or recruiting anybody to the particular devotion of any deity, especially when the devotions that I have are my own, developed over a period of time. So instead, I have a kind of all-purpose dedication of a deck that is for dedicating it for the purposes of working with it over a long-term period of time, And in my case, that's typically 1 year or more. And that's this. The first thing I do is I unwrap the deck. I go through it card by card, and I look at each card and I make some kind of intuitive connection with the card or personal connection. So it may not be that I look at each card and have some kind of a psychic message, but instead I look at each card and I see that in the card there might be one particular little symbol that I resonate with. So maybe on a particular card, there's a hummingbird, or on another card, there's a horseshoe, or on another card, there's a key. And through making a connection with at least one symbol in each card, I begin to create the connection that I have with that card. Over time, all the various different symbols, especially if I'm working with it again and again and again with querent readings, over time, all of the symbols in the card, or at least most of them, will eventually become relevant to me. But as many of you know, there's a lot of different types of tarot art out there, and they're not always mapped to the traditional interpretations of the cards, especially because we have multiple different systems. There's Thoth-based decks and Rider-Waite-Smith-based decks. And then there's also decks that kind of go on a vector off into some other whole mythos. So when I dedicate a new deck, it's really at first just about creating the connection with each card in the deck through one symbol or one element of the card. The second thing that I'll do with a new deck is that I take it home. I have a deck that I use at my office and a deck that I use at home, but almost all of the decks, when they come into my life, they start off in my home. I put it in, I get each one its own special little bag. So every single one of my decks comes out of the box. I never put it back into the box after that. It gets a little special bag or pouch. And I usually try to map like the decorative element of the pouch to the art of the deck. So for example, my Pearls of Wisdom Tarot by Roxy Sim, my cherished, one of my favorite decks ever. I got a pouch that was made out of this like 60s looking psychedelic fabric that mirrors the shapes and colors of the deck. Or my Tarot of the Cat People deck, which is kind of got this like exotic, otherworldly, like space nomads, you know, ancient future look. That goes into a pouch that's made of sheep leather that was hand dyed with saffron, and the pouch was stitched so that the fur is on the inside. So there's this saffron fur on the inside of the pouch. On the outside of the pouch is just this sheep leather. And furthermore, that was made by a friend of mine who inherited like thousands of pelts of sheep fur from her family's defunct factory that used to produce carpets. So it's got like this amazing connection, sort of interesting story behind it. So when I get my, you know, and the pouch isn't always like right then and there when I've bought a deck for myself. It may come along in time, but I usually like there to be some kind of a relationship between the two. Then the second thing that I do is, if I do have the pouch for it, I put it under my pillow and I sleep on top of that deck for 3 nights in a row. And sleeping on top of my deck is a way for me to create a connection so that the symbols are coming through my dream state as well as my waking state. The third thing that I do when I dedicate a new deck is each deck has its own crystal. So a stone that goes with the energy of the deck. And that stone doesn't, after I've given it to the deck, that stone doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the deck. It is the stone that has been given as an offering by me to the deck in an animistic way to bring the deck to life. So between the combination of going through, touching each card, making a connection with every symbol, sleeping on the deck for 3 nights, and giving each deck its special pouch and its special stone, I basically animate the deck and bring it to life. And thereafter, I consider that deck a living creature. It is a living being in my world, and I treat it accordingly. I have lots of different decks that I have used over the period of a year or more for my readings, and I don't obviously like use all of them every day, but I make a connection at least once a year with every single deck that I have, just the same way as like once a year you might have a little reunion with your friends from high school or college. I have reunions with my decks. So where I bring them out and we have a little tarot party and I drink some tea and I pull a card from a bunch of them. I reflect on them. And one of the things I'll describe, which I don't have it right here, but in the future sometime I'll bring it out. I have one deck that I only bring out. I literally only bring it out once a year because it's so fragile at this point. It was the first deck that I used professionally. And what I did with that deck was I wrote on every single card my own interpretations of the card, because when I began reading tarot, I didn't ever actually look at the book or any of the literature about what the cards' traditional meanings were. I spent like the first 2 or 3 years of my tarot journey not having any idea what those meanings were and just reading based on my own internal interpretations of the cards and the art. And I would jot down with a pen on the card itself anytime a new dimension of understanding or awareness came to me through a reading. And I keep those cards in a pouch that was made by a friend of mine who's now deceased, Rev Shields. He was the first person that I was ever a death doula for. And he, when he died, part of what I did was I went through his house with his family and helped them clear out his place. And this pouch was there. And so I took that home, and now that pouch is the pouch, and that pouch is really fragile and the deck is really fragile, and I hardly ever touch it. And I never, ever read for anyone else other than myself with that deck anymore. I retired that deck officially about 6 years ago. So there's, you know, the consecration or dedication of a new deck, but then there's also retiring it. That'll be a different, maybe subject for a different time, but having a way that you say, thank you, and I'm now putting you to rest is just as important when you are working with an animated object as saying hello and welcome. You want to complete the whole loop. And if you don't put a deck to rest, if you choose, or this is true of any magical item, if you don't put it to rest formally, you know, in various different belief systems, and I share this thought, the spirit of that animated object can become angry at you and can start interfering in your life. So I make sure to consecrate and deconsecrate every deck that I work with, or if I'm just basically saying, okay, thank you so much for working with me this year, now I'm moving on to another deck. I don't necessarily fully deconsecrate it, but it goes to live with my other decks and comes out once a year for a reunion. So that's part 1 of dedicating a deck, having a dedicated deck. It could be that this is the deck that you use for your main readings. Myself, I recommend having, so then I'm going to talk about the second one, which actually I'm going to talk about the third. I gave the list, I'm going to do them out of order. The second type of deck that I recommend is that you work with a deck that is separate for yourself from the readings that you might do for others. And I strongly encourage this practice, even though the decks that I use to read for others tend to be accurate and tend to be really evocative, and I could certainly use them to read for myself. What I've found over time is that It's actually better for me if I'm going to do a reading for myself at all, which is very rare. It's better for me to have a deck that is some system that I don't know or don't understand at all. I spend time with the decks that I have, learning about their meanings, the symbolism behind each card, what the author's intention was when they made the deck. And those perceptions come forward in my reading for others. But for myself, I've found if I try to use the deck that I used for others for myself, I have a liability or a risk of selectively interpreting the information of the cards in such a way that will either give me like a false sense of confirmation or a false sense of doom. And either way, however that interpretation comes across, it's become clear to me over time that my own biases will come into play. And all of the things that I've seen in my readings for other people with that deck will flood in. So if I'm sitting there and I'm thinking like, okay, like I'm, wondering about such and such thing, and I draw a card and it's like the Knight of Wands. Now, all the different times that the Knight of Wands have come up in my recent readings for clients are going to come into my mind. And it's kind of like, in a way for me, it's kind of like when you Google your symptoms and then you're convinced that you have every disease on the internet. So all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, it's all going to fall apart because this Knight of Wands. And I can't, it's really hard for me to divorce my personal interpretation. And that's for the negative. And then for the positive, of course, I think we've all been there where we had like a little confirmation bias or some kind of a delusional thought based on like, oh my God, I've had the best sign ever. And it may not be. So instead, what I do is I have a separate deck that is related to a mythology that I don't know anything about. So for example, for a long time before, don't judge, I saw the Lord of the Rings movies before I read the book. Okay, now that's out on the table, everyone knows. But after I saw the movies, I did go back and read the whole book. I had tried reading the book before, but I have to be honest, I would always just like put it down after about 25 pages because I was like, oh my God, like 3 paragraphs on buttered toast. I'm done. Like, I can't even with this. It seemed really like dreary and long. So I couldn't. But once I saw the movies, I was like, okay, I can go back and read this. So for the longest time, my personal deck for myself, this is pre the movies, was a Lord of the Rings tarot because I knew nothing about the story. I knew nothing about the characters. I hadn't read any of the books. I hadn't obviously seen any movies. They hadn't even been made yet. And what would happen is I would pull a card and it would be like Tom Bombadil. And I'd be like, who the heck is that? And then I'd have to go and like research and read. And through the process of reading and researching about this thing that I didn't know anything about, I would get a valid message, a message that I couldn't possibly misinterpret or misunderstand because of the way that it came to me. So nowadays, when I have that kind of a thing, I generally reach for something like a Norse deck, or I have an I Ching deck, based deck. I also have a deck that's based on Rumi quotes. And any of those 3 will work great for me because obviously I've not memorized all of the body of work of Rumi. I've not memorized all of the entirety of the I Ching, and I know very little about Norse mythology. It's just not really my personal pantheon. Nothing against it, just not really where I resonate. So if I reach outside of the systems that I already know, I'm more likely to get a message that I know I have not contrived. So to dedicate a deck for your public purposes, using with your querents, you really want to get all the way up to the elbows in the mythos of that deck, whatever it is, because you really want to understand, you really want to deepen and understand it so that you can give really good messages to your querents. But for a deck that you use for yourself, I recommend dedicating a deck for in the exact opposite way, where it's like, we are not going to be friends. You are my teacher. And where the deck that you use for querents, you're like, no, we are friends. You are going to be my friend, and we're going to be partners, and together we're going to help these other individuals. But for myself, no, I'm not sleeping with you under my pillow. I'm not, and I do give it its own crystal because that's part of my animation process. It will also get its own special little box, but I will not be dedicating that deck as a friend. I will be dedicating it as a teacher. And it's best that that deck knows lots of things that I don't. So that's the second purpose of deck dedication. And then the third purpose of deck dedication would be to receive specific messages from specific beings, where you dedicate a deck to a particular guardian, spirit, goddess, or guide that you work with. You place it on their altar and you say to them, this is going to be our vehicle of communication. This is going to be the way that I receive your messages, which may or may not be in addition to lots of other ways you receive messages from that being. Obviously, you can receive messages from divine beings, allies, ancestors, guardians, and guides in lots of different ways, through the flight of a bird, through the appearance of a particular color or smell. There's lots of ways you can communicate with them. But if you'd like to receive advice, guidance, or messages from them, or if you'd like to work with a deck in a particularly dedicated way for yourself or a group of people, like, for example, we're going to start in a minute here with my deck for our full moons, which are this year, the Temple of Aphrodite, and there's a dedicated deck that I use for Aphrodite. Then in that case, you might want to get a deck that resonates with your understanding and awareness of that being. Obviously, the art will be important. The cultural context of the deck will be important. In some cases, you'll select a deck that is specifically rooted in the cultural paradigm of that being, or you might even find that there are decks that are specifically dedicated to that being. So let's sort of look through what I've got here. For our full moons in the temple this year, we're going to be working with 2 decks. I have one of them with me right now, and I do have their boxes. I keep their boxes to the side so that when I travel, I can protect them. But then when it gets home, it will go into its little pouch. So one of the 2 decks we're using in the full moon ceremonies in the temple this year is the Vintage Wisdom Oracle. And this is by Victoria Mosley. And the reason and then the second deck that we're using in the temple this year is one that I've used with Aphrodite for a long time. It is the Tarot des Femmes Érotiques by, I know her real name. I can't remember her pen name. Oh, Claire de Normand is her pen name. And so both of these oracles have a decidedly like 1920s flair. And the reason that I've chosen these decks is not only because the art is very romantic looking, soft, kind of, dare I say, feminine, and evocative, like this is the intention card that I think we drew recently. But also because specifically, Aphrodite is a complicated cultural goddess. She's not exactly Greek. She's not exactly Turkish. She's not exactly Iranian. she's not exactly a lot of things, but she's sort of all of them. And in American art around the turn of the century, 18 to 1900s, and up through the 1930s or 40s, a big movement in the art world in the United States was what's called the Orientalism movement. Now, Orientalism is what you think it is. It is an exoticization of the art and textiles and architectural shapes, color schemes, and fabrics of Asia, both Asia Major and Asia Minor. Because there is this cultural context wherein people in the United States, artists, often interpreted or reinterpreted these symbols through the kind of colonial gaze. It means two things. One is that it does convey the complicated nature of Aphrodite's being, in that she's a goddess of love, but she's also a goddess of war. She's a goddess of many nations and not any specific one nation. She's a goddess that resonates with the, obviously like beauty and love and magic, but she's also a goddess of complication. And so by working with this particular art form that is like that turn of the century and early modern kind of look, I'm able to sort of tap into those energies. Furthermore, one of the things that was really interesting about art that starts during the Victorian period, and decor particularly that starts during the Victorian period in Europe and America, is that a lot of people don't know this, but the Far East has been a major producer of things like textiles, wallpapers, paper patterns, and other decorative prints for a long time. We tend to think of China, for example, as becoming a major power of production in the post-World War I and post-World War II eras. But actually, China was a major producer much further back. And one of the things that would happen is that Europeans and Americans would say, like, for example, oh, we would really like to make a tulip design for this wallpaper that we want to have. So they would send a picture of tulips to the Chinese producers of wallpaper and textiles to make matching wallpaper and drapes and other things like that. And people in China who had never seen an actual tulip before would receive the hand-drawn sketch of a tulip, and they would be like, what is this? And then they would design a textile with a flower pattern in it that was based on the tulip, but wasn't actually a tulip. So what ended up happening in the period of textile and art design from really like the 1880s on is that there's all of these kind of phantasmagoric flowers and animals that appear that they don't actually exist, but they're the Asian interpretation of a piece of art that was sent by a European person requesting a particular means of production. So I love that about this period in time in art, this like early 20th century period of time in art, because it's like Aphrodite, a product of many different influences and yet not specifically related to any one of them. So that's why I've chosen to work. Many people will think that like I work with the Tarot des Femmes Erotiques or this deck, this Vintage Wisdom Oracle, just because I'm associating Aphrodite with like flappers or like, this kind of aesthetic, but it's not actually just because Aphrodite is like all like pretty flowers and stuff like that. It's actually because there's this complicated history of art around this period of time that, to me, as an American woman, reflects the complicated nature of Aphrodite herself, that she's of this world and yet not of it, that she's a product of many different influences, and that if one were to want to try to tease apart all of the different contributing factors to her, it would be pretty much impossible to trace any of her aspects to any one singular culture. So let's just do a little draw from this deck, shall we? I'll do a draw from each one of these as we go along, just to receive a wisdom message. So this is the deck that's dedicated to Aphrodite. And Aphrodite, I'm just asking if there's any message that you would like to share with this particular group of people for this particular moment in time as part of our class tonight. She says, love. Her message is love for tonight. I think that's a really good sort of self-explanatory message. I don't think I probably need to read the book about it. I think we all know what love is. So the second deck we're going to investigate tonight is the deck that we're using in the, I love the little heart thing. The Tarot des Femmes Erotiques, it was out of print, but if you look on Amazon, maybe not in Australia, but Claire de Normand is selling those decks on Amazon right now under, although maybe Mia and I bought the last two that Amazon had right now, it's totally possible, but she's selling under the title Beauty, History, Magic. And if it turns out that you can't get sold out, I'll send her a message and see. I'm going to see if I can get some more. For a while there was another producer making those decks. What's his name? Jay DeForest. The DeForests who live up in the Pacific Northwest had taken on production of those decks for her. So it is possible that they're still out there. I'll ask and we'll see if we can't get you one. Okay, so the second deck we're working with this year in the temple is the Priestess of Light Oracle. And this is one that I wanted to just touch on because this addresses Sybil Lisette's question the other day about decks that are good for Hakkate. And I noticed that, you know, that thread had some really great suggestions. I personally chose to work with the Priestess of Light Oracle because I like that it has that phosphorus quality. For me, I had a really great conversation after way too much apple wine, sitting with Sorita Deste on her couch in front of her life-size image of Hakkate a few years ago, in which she said something that made me howl with laughter, which was how many people who are dedicated to Hakkate have tended toward this idea that she is the goddess of dark fluff. And her term dark fluff cracked me up. How she was like, it's just sort of like everyone sort of assigns her this personality or something, as if Hakkate is the goddess of like super uber goth vibes, when in fact, Hakkate has many dimensions, as many of us know who work with her, one of which is her phosphorus dimension. And under her phosphorus dimension, she's the light bringer. It's the same thing as addressing Hakkate as people will often say she's a crone goddess, but actually the literature doesn't support that. The literature that we have about Hakkate depicts her more as a virgin goddess or a maiden goddess, more akin to Artemis than a crone. But because of her association with death, and because of the neo-pagan obsession with the maiden mother crone archetype as such, she ends up getting assigned as the crone. So I was deliberately wanting to avoid going in the direction of that dark fluff, because I think sometimes we make Hekate unnecessarily gloomy. And recently, Priestess Cosette wrote a fascinating blog about Hekate as a goddess of sexual boundaries and kink, sacred kink. And I certainly recommend, and it's so controversial that Facebook took it down. So I definitely recommend, Priestess Cosette, that you post that link in the Goddess Temple app. Maybe you can post it in the Tea and Tarot group, or you can post it in the community group, wherever you feel comfortable. But it's a fascinating blog. I read it before the link got stripped from Facebook by the evil overlords who will banish a nipple at the slightest moment, but will allow people to have like full on porn channels, whatever. God forbid we should have a breastfeeding woman or any, mindful priestess talking about sacred kink, as opposed to somebody literally actually posting porn. But I digress. Anyway, Priestess of Light Oracle brings about that phosphoric element of Hekate for me. It's that, and I'm in this process this year based on a promise that I made to Hekate last year in her shrine in Laguna, where Danielle and Rowan and I are going to go again this year, along with some others. When I was there, I made a promise to her to explore some of the lesser known elements of her mythos and to bring to light whatever it is that I'm meant to bring to light as her devotee and priestess. So choosing the Priestess of Light Oracle was a really easy one for me for working with her for this year, because it's literally about shedding light. Now, the Priestess of Light Oracle is made by Sandra Ann Taylor and Kimberly Weber. It has a really fascinating element. I'm going to just pull out a couple cards so that I can show you that in addition to this 53 card deck, in addition to obviously being a lot of different cards related to light, there's an element about it that I really liked, which is that quite a few of the cards in this deck depict predator animals, birds, and big cats. And in our Via Carmen Pythia group, many of you who have been part of that training so far know that we all work with big cat energy, and everybody has her own big cat. I won't really get much more into it than that, but like, here's one beautiful depiction of, a priestess, and she's standing between the two big cats. In this case, they're two leopards. I really, and the title of this is Brilliant Beliefs, Luminous Life Force and Personal Power is the message of this card. But I want to just share with you a couple things I like about these cards. Number one, these cards depict more than just white people. That's a big deal. We really need decks to be fully representative of every different type of background. So in this Priestess of Light Oracle, there are lots of different races and ethnicities depicted. Secondly, Hekate in Asia Minor, in Turkey, takes on many of the aspects of the Phrygian Great Mother, Cybele. And one of the most famous images of Cybele is of her standing on a chariot drawn by two cats, or sitting on a throne with big cats on either side. And third, in Asia Minor, there was, it's now extinct, a native leopard that is depicted in art. And so in the area, one of the main areas where Hekate had a huge cult of worship in the ancient world, there were big cats. Now, today, we mostly associate Hekate with dogs, and that makes sense, especially black dogs, because they were sacrificed to her in ancient Greece. That's why the association is there. They did practice animal sacrifice in ancient Greece. Almost every goddess and god in ancient Greece had particular animals that would be regularly sacrificed to them as part of ritual practice. Obviously, in this temple, we don't do that. But I think it's very interesting that we now associate in modern neo-paganism Hekate's sacrificial animal with her more than the animals that are actually native to the places where she was worshipped. And in ancient Greece and in ancient Turkey, it was panthers, baby. It was leopards. It was like these big cats, and they were not sacrificed to her. They were her companion animals, which I'm an all animals person, but like I am a crazy cat lady. So knowing that there's a connection between Hekate and cats, and because I am a cat lady, is very good for my soul. Here's another card from this deck. It's called Courage. Shows a woman wearing a leonine headdress. And another card from this deck. This one is gorgeous, depicting, it's called Innovation. And the woman has two birds of prey hawks flying forth from her hands. And I'll show one or two more here. This one is called Loss or Lack and depicts an owl, which worldwide has an association with being the harbinger of sorrow and death. Although I still love owls and I can find ways to eke positive meaning out of them. And then of course, we also have, this is like a very Hekatean card. This is, I would argue, one of the more Hekatean cards in this deck. Depicts a woman, her eyes are whited out. She's got long black hair. She's wearing a necklace of coins, very similar to what we would see in Turkoman jewelry, like ancient Turkic jewelry. And she's got a wolf and she's shedding light out of her hand. And this is the guide card. She's shedding light on the path from her hand. She's got her sacred wolf companion. There's her jewelry. So when I was looking through this deck, as some of you might recall, I was using the Priestesses of Light Oracle totally inappropriately during the month of Santa Muerte, because I never did get that deck home from the store. It was on her shrine at my store, and I was like, oh, kept being like, I have to bring it home. I have 3 Santa Muerte decks, and she would not let me take any of them home. Every single time I'd go, I'd take them, I'd put them, okay, don't forget this, take this home. They still ended up back on her altar. So at a certain point, I was just like, okay, I have a feeling that a new Santa Muerte deck may come into my world this year, because she wasn't letting me use any of the ones that are currently dedicated to her. I have 2 of the Fabio Listrani decks, an Oracle and a Tarot, and I have the another deck. The name will come to me, but anyway, as I was working with this deck through that whole month of November, and I was looking at the symbolism, I was like, this is actually a Hekate deck. It's not meant to be, it's not designed to be. I don't think that the women, when they made this beautiful deck, were thinking about that. And yet here we are. The other thing that I want to talk about briefly about why I dedicated this deck to Hekate is because I am in the business of taking new age things and reverse engineering them so that they have classical meaning. Because a lot of the new age literature out there is, forgive me, incoherent. It is not related to anything classical. It is literally just somebody had an idea and they created an idea. And I so support the creative interpretation of our ideas in this world. But at the same time, I am a historian, and I do like there to be some kind of connection with the ancient meanings of various different goddesses. So like if you come and you tell me, well, I just really feel like, let me think of a good one. Like if you come and you say to me, I just really associate the 444 angel number with Bridget. I'm not going to fight with you too much about it, but I am going to ask you to tell me why you think that and how you got there. Because sometimes we receive something in a new age way, and it may or may not have an echo in history. And if we can find where its echo of history is, it sometimes can be so rewarding to be like, oh, look, this goddess is actually helping all of us to evolve our awareness of her by manifesting herself in this new format or with these new associations in this current now moment. But of course, traditionally, Bridget's number is 3. But if you say to me, well, yeah, that's true, Bridget's number is 3, but there's in that 444 number, there's 3 4s, and she had 4 major sacred wells that were in this one area. I will totally go with you on that. But if you can't establish some kind of a connection, then I might say, why don't we look at something a little more traditional? So in this way, I am hoping through this year to work with some of the new age concepts in this deck and see where I can make those ancient connections to Hekate. So for example, the card I just drew has a fairy on it. She's like a tree spirit. She's not a fairy. She's like a tree spirit. And it says sacred gratitude, reverent appreciation, and prayer. I'll show you the card. She's got like wings made of light. So for me, as a historian, I might think, okay, what is this trying to tell me? What is Hekate trying to tell me through this imagery? I might research trees associated with her. I might look up like, what connection does she have to winged beings? Are there any depictions of her with wings? Are there any depictions of her with trees? Are there any stories about her flying? Are there any, and there are actually depictions of her with wings. My phone is like somewhere else, so I can't find, no, I can probably find it. Hang on, let me find it, because this is important. Let's see if I can get it here. There is actually a fantastic image, classical image of her, where she's got wings. Here we are. I'm going to pull it up. Okay, let me share my screen so you can see. In this depiction, the night of Enitharmon's joy, it's referred to as the Triple Hakkate, or simply Hakkate. It's a 1795 work of art by English artist and poet William Blake, which depicts Enitharmon, I don't know if I'm saying that right, sorry, a female character in his mythology, or Hekate, a chthonic Greco-Roman goddess of magic in the underworld. The work presents a nightmarish scene with fantastic creatures. So now let me get this image. Oh, software updates. I've got like all this stuff that's coming up. Hang on, let me stop my share for a second so that I can clear this out of the way and get you to this actual image. Okay, here we go. Oh, let's get it in a new tab. Oh, relief. Here we go. So here is a close-up of the work. And in this work, she's sitting here and she's got these 2 beings on either side of her. But if you sort of step back and look, they almost look like wings. And above her is a winged, almost looks like a bat. And over here we have this owl. So there's this sort of connection that's happening here, that where you think you're seeing Hekate with wings. So in that sense, I might go looking for these kinds of things in a dedicated deck. If I've dedicated a deck to a deity and something comes up that I'm like, that really seems weird, or that seems incongruous, I will go and look and see, because eventually, if I just keep looking, I will find that relationship, whatever it is. So I'm going to stop this for now. So our card from Hekate is tonight, because it's the one that I drew spontaneously, is this sacred gratitude card, reverent appreciation and prayer. Let's go see what our New Age authors have to say about this and see where we can get some further perspective. The card brings a simple but profoundly important message to you. The woman peacefully stands alone in a quiet forest, reverently placing her hands on the ancient tree. With eyes closed, she feels a deep connection to the towering tree, truly appreciating its graceful, majestic presence in her life. This card is telling you to let go of external concerns long enough to spend some time in sacred gratitude. This reverent appreciation calls for you to pause and reflect, to truly feel the value of your life and of your earthly environment down to the depths of your very soul. This is not so much about listing all the good things you already have, as it is about simply experiencing the wonder of being one with nature, one with your soul, and one with this planet and everything on it. So already we have, what do we have here? A little soteria or sotera. I don't know how to say that. I've seen it written so many different ways. The world soul, that's what Hekate is, right? She's the world soul. This mystical approach is easy to adopt through a meditative thought, a deep breath, or a quiet smile. Be careful not to dismiss this choice as frivolous. Okay, now we're getting into something a little bit heavier, deeper here. This inwardly peaceful intention is actually a dynamic energy accelerator. Each quiet, uncluttered moment of gratitude will summon the communal grace of both the creative and magnetic forces flowing through this world, and you can ride those energetic waves with joy. So take some time to engage in this deeper sense of gratitude now. And if this card is surrounded by activity-filled, high-energy cards in your spread, it's all the more important to weave those peaceful moments of grateful reflection into your daily life. Profound appreciation brings expansive and valuable results. And the affirmation of this card is, I let go of external concerns and stop to appreciate life's deeper value. My spirit is grateful for life itself. So in this, we've got our tree research we can go do. Anybody know any sacred trees that are associated with Hekate? Or have any that you have established for yourself? Go ahead, Lisette.
I don't have a specific tree, but I do associate lavender to her. So the herb of lavender, I think immediately Hekate, and I give her lavender. Every dark moon, I put lavender in her offerings, and the smell of lavender, I have a little lavender perfume that I dedicated to her.
Okay. That's a good association and very good personal association. I'm kind of looking more for a trees.
Tree.
Is there anybody who's got a tree that they know of as associated?
I read about cypress once.
That's right.
And on New Year's Day, I went down to Moss Beach, and there was just tunnels and tunnels of cypress trees that I took some really great pictures of. Yeah.
That's right. So in this, we can then, that's exactly the one that I had in mind too, the cypress tree. And we can then go search. And I bet if we looked long enough, we would find associations between the cypress tree and moments of quiet reflection or gratitude. And spoiler alert, if you go look in your Goddesses and Guides lessons, the cypress tree is in one of our Goddesses and Guides lessons, and we can see what's in there. Okay, so, and thank you, Lisette. I know I have a lot of herbal associations with Hekate as well. And I'm glad to hear you've got a strong connection that's so tangible and potent, and it's so fantastic that it's got such a distinct scent. Okay, so those are the two decks that I brought that we're working with for our full and dark moons this year that are dedicated decks. Now, there's two more decks that I have and these are pretty self-explanatory, but the Mother Mary Oracle, which we work with in the month of the Black Madonna, and this Guanyin Oracle, which we work with in the month of Guanyin, which is February. And I actually have two Guanyin decks. There's two different Guanyin decks that were made by Alana Fairchild. This one, where the artwork is by, I think this artwork is by Zhang Hao. Yeah, this artwork is by Zhang Hao, and then the Wild Guanyin Oracle has artwork by Wang Yiguang. And this work, it depicts kind of more of, you know, I don't want to say specifically Chinese zeitgeist, but it is kind of, insofar as a lot of the classical headdresses and their shapes are there, and some of the animals and mythologies that are associated in this deck are more specifically Chinese, whereas the deck by Wang Yiguang has more of a Tibetan flair with like yaks and traditional Tibetan looking fabrics and mountains and that kind of thing. So in this deck, now I've seen criticisms online of this deck that the artwork looks too Caucasian. And in some cases, I think it does too. In other cases, it doesn't. It does look more specifically Asian. But I think that the person, like, for example, this image does not specifically look Asian. But in this image, she definitely is. I think that the artist, when he, and I've never met him and I didn't ask, so I don't know for sure, but I think that the artist designed a set of paintings that were deliberately intended to appeal to a wide audience. I can only imagine that if Alana Fairchild came to me and said, would you do artwork for my Oracle deck? And knowing that this is a woman who sells thousands and thousands and thousands of decks worldwide, I might design something that looks very broad, but at the same time, it's not got anybody with dark skin in it. However, it does have beings in it who look not Caucasian white, but like deity white. Like a lot of depictions of deities have them looking like Snow White. And that Snow White look is not meant to necessarily depict Caucasian skin. It's meant to depict that they are beings made of light. So discerning that is an important aspect. And then in the deck by Wang Yiguang, that Guanyin Oracle often depicts darker skinned Asian beings, specifically Asian, more indigenous looking people. So Guanyin is a popular goddess worldwide. Lots of different people from lots of different cultures work with her. It would make sense actually for the next major Guanyin Oracle that comes out in the world, Alana Fairchild, if you're listening, I would love to see a deck for Guanyin that depicts all races, because she's universal. Compassion is a universal value that's found all over the world. And by this point, Buddhism is everywhere as well. So the card that I just sort of drew for us here is Daughter of the Phoenix. So let's see what is said about this card. When the soul is ready to spread its wings, it goes through a deep cleansing, purification, and preparation for new levels of spiritual wisdom, power, and light. Just like the phoenix that is baptized through celestial fire to be born anew, you are going through such a phase of heavenly purification, preparation, and initiation. This is an advanced phase of soul growth, and soon after, you will enjoy greater spiritual peace, divine power, and advancement on your divine life path. Guanyin, Daughter of the Phoenix, has been through fire, both physically and heavenly, and has ascended into a position of great spiritual peace, power, and authority. She guides you now to claim your rebirth and ascend. And what I love about this is that even though it's written in New Age language, it actually really mirrors the mythos of Miao Shan, who was the human woman whose father wanted to force her to marry. And she said no. And so he cast her out of the family compound, which is as good as being thrown to the, to die in the ancient world for a young woman. And instead she went and she lived in a cave and became a happy Buddhist meditator. And then when her father grew very, very ill, his advisors said that in order to heal, he would need someone to sacrifice their limbs for him. And his daughter Miao Shan showed up. And even though he had treated her so badly, she sacrificed her limbs for him. And as she died from that sacrifice, she became a transcendent bodhisattva of compassion. Now, there's lots of, feminist interpretations of this myth that would be very critical. And I'm 100% with you if you're having them in your mind right now. But that said, the process of becoming a bodhisattva, it requires great self-sacrifice. So through this myth of going through the fire, going through a time of trial, and choosing to still give of yourself, one transcends and becomes the bodhisattva. So even though Alana Fairchild doesn't specifically write about the bodhisattva path in this deck, there are lots of references in this deck that shows me that she has done her work and that she knows what the myths are that she's trying to convey in a New Age way. She references Magu, she references the Pleiades as the 7 star blossom sisters, she references the Tao, she references several things in this deck that show me that she went and did her homework. And even though she's not necessarily always depicting the classical myths, she is depicting the classical concepts in a way that's relevant to a modern practitioner and would be relevant to someone who doesn't know them. So although there is a lot of criticism for this deck out there, I also think there's a lot of strength in that deck. Then we have the Mother Mary Oracle, which by now, I don't need to really explain my purpose much, but I'm going to just draw us a card. This deck is a combination of the artwork of Sophia Shiloh McLeod and the words of Alana Fairchild. And again, in this deck, one thing I really like about it is that while it does trend a little bit more white, it also does have multiple different skin colors depicted. Now, a Sophia Shiloh McLeod face is a Sophia Shiloh McLeod face. All of her faces have a look. It's her signature as an artist. So you're not going to see a huge variety in what the faces look like that depicts like a lot of different ethnic characteristics. There's a face. There's a face. The aquiline nose, the wide set eyes, the high brow. These are characteristic. And these are basically 4 different skin tones on very similar faces. And that's just her signature. It's not necessarily because she's, trying to erase difference. She does give them different skin tones, but she does use her signature face. In this deck, I dedicated this deck to the Black Madonna, and we work with this deck in the Temple's Black Madonna month in June. And this year, we're also going to be working with it in our monthly Black Madonna ceremonies, which start this Wednesday. Is it this? No, it's next Wednesday. No, this Wednesday. Sorry, I forgot the date. So let's have one card.
26, isn't it the Tuesday?
Tuesday. It's always on the 4th Wednesday.
4th Wednesday. Okay.
So if I put it wrong in the calendar, it's possible that I put it wrong in the calendar, but I hope I didn't. Okay. Our Lady of the Ocean of Rebirth. And how amazing that right before February 1st, we would get this card, because February 1st is known most kind of broadly in neo-paganism as Brigid's Day, Imbolc, but it's actually also a sacred festival of Iemanjá, at least in Brazil. Next year, the temple is doing a pilgrimage to Brazil for this day. Just saying, plan ahead. So, Our Lady of the Ocean of Rebirth. I have a friend who has a retreat house in Brazil and is friends with a lot of different Umbanda practitioners in that area. And so she's invited us as a temple to come and do Iemanjá Day and to be there for that. Okay. So I champion your growth always. I know when hard edges are best to be softened and when it is time for you to receive reward for efforts made. Allow me to help you release a karmic pattern so that you can now be reborn into new consciousness. Allow me to help you heal your life from the inside, that the outside may also change and reflect your inner beauty and spiritual light. I'm bringing you assistance, that a force beyond your control may now be softened and your successful growth is assured. So, another wonderful divination. It's kind of nice to follow on the heels of, you're going through the fire, keep going. And maybe we might even infer from this combination of cards that going through the fire from now until Imbolc is just what it's all about, that we're being tempered in Brigid's forge, or we're being tempered in the forge of the Great Mother, but not to forget that the great ocean of vastness is where we're going to get to plunge the molten metal of our inner forging so that it will cool and that there will be reward. So these decks obviously are very distinct. They're dedicated to the particular deity from the get-go. It's like a no-brainer. There's an Isis oracle, there's Tara oracles. You can find oracles out there for a wide variety of different goddesses. And my recommendation is that if you are, dedicating to a particular goddess, you look to see if there's a deck for her. And if there isn't, think about making one. Okay, so last but not least, our very last bit. Okay, good. We've got the deck that we're using right now, the guidance cards, which are I'm using these for Prajnaparamita. I chose these cards for Prajnaparamita because they are very meta. The cards, if you've been doing practice with me at all this month, you'll notice that the cards in this deck are really very conceptual. There's a lot of discussion of the light body, the etheric body, the energetics. It's not always super earth-based guidance. It's not like, go clean your closet today. It's more like, what kind of energy are you trying to inhabit in your space at this time? So Prajnaparamita is not a conceptual goddess. She's a wisdom goddess, but these cards bring forward a wisdom that is beyond purely the experiential and is more transcendent. And this deck is all about kind of getting that bigger view. And every single deck, or every single card in this deck has a depiction on it. Oh my God, huge deck, 133 cards. Look at how many cards are in this deck. It's enormous. All of the cards in this deck have an image on them of Mount Shasta. And that's the only artwork for the entire deck. So on the back, this is what the back looks like. So the author of this deck, Alu Gutmela, she lives in Mount Shasta. She actually sometimes hosts public classes and things there. She has written in this deck about a lot of different principles, many of which are transcendent of any one particular religion or particular belief system. And that's part of the reason why I selected this for her. So the card here for this is, love is not the intense desire to own or possess another in order to feel a sense of wholeness. Love is not the thrill of conquest or obtaining what seems to be a great prize, which often becomes a great burden instead. Love is not an external focus, which brings a sense of vulnerability, thus constantly seeking validation from someone or something. Love is not self-sacrifice or victimhood, giving away so much of yourself that you no longer have an identity of your own. Love is not enabling those around you to dishonor you and abuse you by reinforcing your own projections of unworthiness. Much forgiveness, kindness, and gratefulness are the buttresses for self-love and the love of others. So you can see that this is not really like a card telling you go do a physical thing. This is a card talking about a state of being. And that's why I chose that for Prajnaparamita, because Prajnaparamita is the ground of being in our temple. So a state of being is the right kind of messaging for her. And then last but not least, and this is an oracle that I've dedicated to personal messages, I have Carolyn Hillier's Weaver's Oracle. It's called Weaver's Oracle, Journey Cards and Travel Guide. I bought this oracle in England. I don't know anywhere. I don't know if it's sold in the US. It's probably sold online though. But Carolyn Hillier lived among the Nennet people, circumpolar people, and reindeer herders. And this deck reflects years and years of her artistic depictions of her time among the Nennet people. And she's still in connection with them. And because Carolyn Hillier, she's got in her backyard in Wales or in Western England, she's got a recreation of a Neolithic settlement. And she teaches about the Neolithic period, the wisdom of that period of time, how people survived, what spiritual principles were important to them. So it's pre-colonial, and part of her life's work has been to make those connections amongst many different pre-colonial societies. And so interesting, when I just opened this deck, the most recent card that I had drawn from it was, this was such a hard card, and oh my God, I only draw from this deck maybe once or twice a year, but it was the Udagan Udagan is the name for shaman, female shaman. It was the edge, Udagan of the lost drum, and it was all about coping with loss. And this was a card that I drew this really helped me through some grief process. So it must be time to draw a new one, which I will do. But this is for us all, not just for me. And the card that I have drawn for us is Braid, Udagan of the Bear Claw. And here she is. And when Carolyn Hillier did these cards, for some of them, she made a skirt. When she made these paintings, all of the paintings that became this deck are actually like 6 foot tall paintings. And for some of them, she actually wove or made the skirt in a 3-dimensional form and attached it to the painting. So this, for example, is an image of the painting. What you can't see is that if you were to be in real life with this painting, that skirt is 3-dimensional. It's actual fabric coming off the canvas. She made tools for each of these. Her process with this deck was really amazing, and I had a chance a few years ago to hear her speak about her creation of this deck. Okay, card 31. And in each of these cards, I won't read you the whole thing, but each of these cards has 3 parts: her yarn, her braid, and her cloth. The yarn is the story of the card's basis. The braid is about the symbolism that's in the card, and the cloth is the message. So I'm just going to read the cloth. Our truest apprenticeships grow slowly and quietly like our hair, like our deeper understanding of the world. The most enduring initiations we might undertake as warrior women involve some measure of sincere sacrifice, some humble statement of intent. But how can we be sure where to find our courage if we have not first tested ourselves along its defiant blade? We must hone our spirits and gird our fierce souls. We may sift through many thousand years of human lives, seeking to understand a pattern in people's loves and losses, and yet we will arrive at this place where we still battle to keep hearths and homelands safe, to maintain the earth's integrity, to repair what is being stripped away by vengeful swords, malevolent creeds, and the wholesale destruction of women's wisdom. As warriors, we will eventually be called to account. All the knowledge, experience, and bravery we may have accrued along our paths will have a role to play, or else, what has this challenging journey been for? Every deepening initiation we have undergone, each transforming ritual, will contain at its raw center a pressing purpose, and we must learn to read the rhythms of the age. Then we will know when it is the right time for action, when our wild songs become our weapons and our protective claws are bared. Or when the time calls for quiet watchfulness, when trust and hope alone become our mighty shields. There is much work to be done, and a world is waiting to be reshaped with kindness. So that's our message from the Udagan of the Bear Claw. I hope that tonight's class has been helpful and enjoyable for you. We've gotten some really good messages, some good food for thought to carry through the remainder of our month of Moon on Snow and into our month of Moon and Ice next month. And I hope that going forward, you'll take the deep dive to dedicate some of your decks, to have decks for the goddesses you work with and spirits you work with, to dedicate decks for specific purposes, and also to have the courage to have a decks that you don't understand at all, so that you're forced to follow whatever the book says. Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to show, I was desperately trying to find an oracle to work with Bridget, and that is like the hardest thing in the world, to find one that like I can really connect. So the closest I got was the Elemental Oracle. And it's not Celtic in any way, but it does have very raw elemental cards like volcano, the ocean, the fire, the sun. So I felt that it kind of, the way that I view Bridget, it was a little closer to that viewpoint of her having multiple elements to her.
Yeah,
like
and
water,
she is the goddess of all the elements. You know, really, earth, air, fire, and water, they're all part of her. The air with her bardic, the water with her sacred and holy wells, the earth with her healing herbs, the fire with her flame tending. It makes a lot of sense. What a great pairing. And what an innovative connection, and a great way for you to then receive very specific elemental messages from her that transcend the surface level of her mythos and might take you a little bit deeper into the less explored elements of her.
When you add the crystals, because I'm going to get the crystals now for my decks. Are the crystals supposed to be to clear the deck, or is it?
It's both. I usually place the crystal with the deck, and yes, it will help to clear the energy between readings. And also it will just be a gift, your gift as a practitioner to the deck. And by giving the gift of the crystal to the deck, you're honoring the spirit of the deck, and you're making friends. It's kind of like you wouldn't show up at someone's house empty-handed if they invited you over for dinner. You might show up with a little dessert or a bottle of wine or some flowers or a little plant like that. So it's a classical way of making friends.
Okay. Do you put these under your pillow when
The
it's these kind of
crystals?
decks?
Oh yeah,
No,
yeah.
I mean the decks when they're for the goddess, like when it's
Mhm.
personal. Like,
Oh, no, no, when it's for the goddess, that doesn't go under my pillow, that goes on her altar. And then it stays on her altar. And the only time I use it is if I'm communicating with her.
okay. Okay. And you don't do readings for other people. It's just for you
No, I
and the
might.
goddess?
If somebody is like coming to me and they're like, well, you know, I'm trying to connect with Aphrodite. Do you have any ideas about like what I might need to do or think about? Then I might say, well, you know what? Let's look at her deck and see. So it would be for when I feel like that there's already a relationship. But, you know, just keep in mind, I don't want to inadvertently conscript someone into the service of a goddess that they don't already have a relationship with.
Okay.
Like I would never draw a card for from Santa Muerte's deck for anybody who's not working with her, because to create a potential obligation in that person could put their life at risk. Like if they don't know, because you don't like work with her lightly ever.
Okay. That makes sense.
Mhm.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to close our class. We're just at our time. And thank you so much for coming tonight. And we will be back again next fourth Sunday at 5 p.m. Pacific for the February session. Have a good one, everybody. And thank you for coming. Bye.